We will call the Coronavirus Ad Hoc Committee to order for October the 17th. Ms. Carrillo, if you will, please call the roll.
Brenham,
Here.
Barron,
Here.
Newton.
Here.
Have a quorum.
Just want to acknowledge that Ms. Newton is traveling for work, but she is joining us virtually, and we thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Newton. And we also have here in the chambers, Councilwoman McBride and Teresa. Thank you for joining us. Our next order of business is the approval of minutes from September the 19th, 2023. You can find those on pages 5 through 7. Do we have any changes that need to be made to our minutes? Not out.
Move to approve.
Second.
Ms. Carrillo?
Brenham,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Next order of business is the adoption of the agenda. Mr. Brown, do we have any changes that need to be made to our agenda?
No recommended changes.
Thank you. Now I'll entertain a motion to accept the agenda.
So moved.
Second, Ms. Carrillo?
Brenham,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
And so our next item on our agenda is up for discussion at this point. And what I'd like to do is just remind those who are viewing or will view in the future, County Council, we put forth $16 million out to the community and for local nonprofits and small businesses as a part of our ARPA funds. Many of those categories have been awarded. We are in the process of making our final awards as well as contacting the applicants. And with that, we do have two categories that still we've not awarded, and I'll mention this category and then we'll come back to it. But in item B, 4B, with the affordable housing funding plan, what we said was that we moved that money to general fund. So those funds no longer fall under ARPA. However, that is a category that we did have under this process. And then for 4A, which is youth and recreation services, or recreation services are the category that we had there, that was left and held in committee. There's $1 million to still be awarded. And what I'd like to do is open up some discussion on how we'd like to proceed in awarding these funds, and so that they can in return get to the community. Ms. McBride and I attended a community event today, and we're talking about just some of those same areas of youth services, recreation, and things of that nature. So we do know that there is a need in our community. And as there is a need in our community, I just wanted to open up the discussion so that we can see what direction we want to go. And Ms. Newton, I'm definitely going to start with you because I know this was one of those areas that you wanted us to, to make sure that it was on the list. It's on the list. We made a commitment to keep it in the committee because we didn't feel comfortable with the selections that we had. So I'd love to hear from you if you have any thought as to how we could proceed with moving forward.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, so I have some comments and I have some questions, but first, is ACA Thomas attending this meeting virtually?
She is.
Okay, perfect, because she and I spoke today, and there's some information I want to be clear on about what our parameters are and how we can provide these funds. But thank you for us having this conversation. And I will start out by saying that I don't have definite answers yet and look forward to continuing to have conversations with the body. My understanding is that we have until December of 2024 to commit these funds, which is not my way of saying we need to wait until December of 24, just acknowledging it. From my perspective, one of the conversations that I think we need to have is, as we look at these funds, are we looking at things that'll have a one-time impact, or are we looking at sustainability? And there are pros and cons both ways. I just think it's a conversation for us to have. I think as we look at our community, there are a lot of needs for recreation. There are a lot of needs for, supporting kids at summer camps and those types of things, which tend to be more one time versus, I don't know if there are organizations that serve the entire county that could really benefit from doing some things that are more sustainable. But I'm really curious to know what others think on that front. But basically, when we had the applicants before, I felt like they were targeting honest to goodness adults. And so for me, while every youth is a youth, I really do think of those kids who are, close to teenagers, though it doesn't have to be, some of those kids who would really benefit from having structured activities so that, during the summer and at other times they're being enriched and they're being given opportunities to grow and opportunities to stay out of trouble while they're being enriched and having opportunities to grow. So I think that there are needs all around the county. And so for me, I would be looking for how can we have a footprint that is across the county? And otherwise, like I said, I'm really open to ideas here as long as we are, again, targeting truly that young population and giving them opportunities to have activities and grow. So I will pause there, and at whatever point is appropriate, I would love to hear from staff about any parameters on what we can do and who we can offer these services and programs to in a way that's going to be consistent with federal guidelines.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. And so it is my understanding you did start by asking if ACA Thomas was online. So would you like to address that question to her?
If she's the person that Mr. Brown thinks would be best to answer those questions, then absolutely. I know she's got some answers.
He's laughing. Mr. Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, ma'am. I would like to hear the feedback that ACA Thomas has as a part of that discussion that she had with Ms. Newton. Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Perfect.
Yep, I can. Thank you. Madam Chair, if I may be recognized.
Yes, you're recognized.
Thank you. So in having discussions this morning with Ms. Newton, one of the things that there were a couple of different options that she was interested in finding out relative to how we may be able to disperse funds to benefit youth. And luckily, where I am, I happen to have our consultants here today and was able to actually speak directly with them to confirm what my thoughts were. While every child is important, it does not remove the process for us to have to identify how that these people were negatively impacted by COVID. And granted, we are far down the road from the beginning of the pandemic, but that still leads, there's still the need to identify that any program that we support actually supports or encompasses those individuals who were most negatively impacted by COVID. So that means that if you were to do, for instance, a summer camp, there would be, or summer camps around the county, or you were going to find groups that did this, and you were going to arrange to potentially make a commitment on behalf of specific youth going to these camps. We could have a beneficiary relationship, and that would mean that basically the county would then have to write the checks to the individuals, but that would also mean that the county would have to determine how to qualify these individuals. And one of the examples that the consultant gave us is that typically you can look at family income, and one great way to do that generally is that families whose children qualify for free and reduced lunch typically would be eligible. So that is one relationship that would be a possibility. The other, but that has a lot of expense and a lot of work that goes along with it. The other is that if you were to choose to support a group that supports these programs, likewise, they're going to have to make sure that their expenditures qualify. But the same token along that platform is that if they are, as they select you to be in these programs, they're going to have to do the same thing that the county would do in showing that the people that they are assisting are actually qualified as those most negatively impacted by COVID. And I'll stop there and ask if anyone has questions.
Any questions? Mr. Branham?
Thank you. I was just thinking about education and so many of the reports that we've seen about children scoring more poorly through COVID, and wondered if, as far as youth services goes, whether we thought like tutoring would qualify for, kind of our intents.
Madam Chair, if I'm
Recognize.
so of the same type, whether it would define the committee's, whether it would meet the committee's definition of recreation, I can't answer that question, but I can tell you that it could possibly be a use that would be sanctioned as qualified. But again, when you select those individuals that participate, there would have to be a qualifier for that group, that group would have been most negatively impacted by COVID. So it would have to follow some of the needs requirements as well.
Just follow up on that. So would it be too broad then if, we had some statistic that indicated that, third, fourth, and fifth graders, the overall average score on standardized testing dropped through those COVID years? Would that be too broad?
I would have to have that qualified a bit further. I would have to run that by our consultant. Keep in mind that with these rules and the regulations that are out there, they didn't really address prolonged initiatives like the education component that you're speaking to now. What they addressed was specific COVID impacts. Now, I agree that that's a COVID impact, but I'm happy to find out that for you.
Okay, thanks. I just definitely goes to my concern, which is also something that was expressed by ACA Thomas now, just having to create that connection and demonstrate the negative impact from a period of time that's moving further and further away from us. And when it comes to thinking about recreation, I feel like that's even more ambiguous, at least in my mind. Maybe somebody could provide some data that would help make it feel that there was a more direct connection and some sort of benefit that could be had right now that would help to offset something that, maybe was a negative impact like 2 or 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago. But I just think about the fact that the test scoring seems to still be trying to catch back up, and I would need to, check in on that, see what the progress was. But that's something that I felt like could clearly address a negative impact that has been well reported. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Newton, I see your hand, but Ms. McBride had her hand up first, so we'll address Ms. McBride and then we'll come to you, Ms. Newton.
I just want to follow up. Well, we've already done the coronavirus grants. So we know the requirements from ARPA because we already did those grants. So our requirements for the grants that have already been approved is no more, no less than these that we're beginning to think about. You following me, Mr.? So we've already approved ARPA grants funding. you have to have the same guidelines that we approved the other coronavirus funding. Are you there? You follow me?
Just about the first statement that we've already approved the funding. I thought that's part of what we're still going through right
But
now.
I'm talking about the other coronavirus grants.
Okay,
The prior grants we approved this year.
yes.
Okay, so there were guidelines that we had to follow. So don't get so caught up where these guidelines are going to be any different from those guidelines. Okay, I think we're beginning to make it more complicated than it actually is, because we still have to follow the same guidelines that were used for the funding of the other projects. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the category is youth and recreational, which is a broad category that could include a lot. And that category is based on what this council approved, even though we didn't give the definition of what it was. So that leaves us with some room to determine what youth is and what recreation. So when you speak about education, then youth are part of that. Education is a part of that youth system. When you speak about the impact of COVID on the educational system, then we've got federal, state documentation that shows that the students lost learning during that period. And you don't recoup that learning in a year or two. It takes a while. So from my perspective and understanding of numbers and grants and the foundation of writing a grant, I don't think that's going to be a major issue unless we're going to go back and change all those other programs that we funded. So, so that's the other area. But I do think that in terms of the issues that we are now facing involving youth, they have been serious for a very long time. And you know, Ms. Barron, you and I just left a forum, a community forum, and we talked about the problems and issues that our youth are having, and three, just in your district, 3 innocent young lives were taken unnecessarily. And these are the issues that I think that we need to be looking at, because a lot of it is directly and indirectly related to COVID and other social issues that we have. So as we began to look at the youth and recreational category, I think we do need to look at the data that we have. And then we can look at all the COVID information is based on zip codes. So we can immediately look at 29203. That was one of the high areas where COVID had hit. So we can find that data, the impact of COVID in Richland County. So that part is not going to be that difficult. But I think if we're going to do a true funding, and if we're going to follow the guidelines that were put forth, even though the guidelines were made to allow the counties to have some flexibility in the funding. That's how the guidelines were set up. So I think we need to look at it in broad terms of youth and the recreational category, and to make sure, I'm glad that Ms. Thomas said that, is to make sure that we get those communities that were directly impacted by COVID, and we can do that through looking at DHEC data. So, and I think that we got a lot of good information coming from the communities on their needs and all. I think this is the time that we can really have a just program that will equitably serve all of the communities that were severely or seriously impacted by COVID. And I think this would give us an opportunity to undo some.
Thank you, Ms. McBride. Ms. Newton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. I'm trying to figure out where to go from there. So my question was, so as we look at the impacts of COVID, let me just ask this, because Mr. Branham started to make me think in a different direction. Are there, in terms of awarding these funds, are there any, are we bound by, sorry, I'm having a really hard time asking my question if you can't tell. So as I look at COVID and kind of speaking to some of the things that Ms. McBride mentioned, there are long-term implications. There are short-term implications, certainly, but there are also long-term implications. And so one of the reasons that that broad category of recreation was chosen by council is in part because of impacts on our health and impacts of people being able to get out, but also the thing that would be tough for us to, figure out how we wanted to talk about, but is real nonetheless, are mental health consequences. I mean, I think that, we all globally experience collective trauma as a part through COVID, and we're dealing with a lot of consequences through that with not just academic performance, but behavior, et cetera. And so I guess I'll just operate that staff will tell me if it's not appropriate, but that, I mean, we're really looking at these broad consequences of COVID. But I guess my other question, and certainly, obviously, we want to address, people who are dramatically impacted by COVID or most impacted or whatever the language is. But I guess I just want to be clear. To me, I mean, so many of our children were affected by COVID. I mean, I guess there's one kid somewhere who maybe wasn't, but is, whether it's census tract or income or some of the other things that you mentioned, are those the only ways that we can look at children who would be eligible to be served by these funds? Or is that something that we can continue to research and look at?
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, so there is some general information to answer your question, Ms. Newton. If you go back and look at a packet that we provided from NACO, you will see in there that general information said that there are some general socio determinants that are pretty standard, but that organizations could also look at data in their communities to more define a group. But we just have to make sure that, we are aware of what we're doing that complies. But the short answer is there are some general standards, and that the guidance did say that you could do like a subgroup impact, but that you have to basically be able to, in short, justify that information. So there is the ability for you to do more time or more digging specific to things that you might want to look at beyond maybe, mortality rates or something of that nature. And just as an example, I was just looking while we were sitting here under the tracker that NACO has for local government ARPA investments. And I hate that Mr. Branham stepped out, because I was going to just address this as an example of what he was talking about. But there's a program in Idaho that addressed the negative economic impacts that focused on healthy childhood environments and home visiting. And what they did was they provided a resource because of education, where persons would go into homes of individuals that were more disparately impacted and provided educational assistance. So just as an opportunity to have that discussion of what something could look like. So that's a program that they developed that had a negative economic impact that dealt with, on some levels, childhood education and environmental impact. So there is the ability for Richland County to use Richland County specific data to address those types of things that you all might have interest in.
Thank you. Ms. Sparrow.
Just one quick moment, Ms. Newton, and I'll yield the floor back to you. But I think also in this, Mr. Brown, correct me if I'm wrong, I hear us talking a lot about individuals. However, communities can be identified. So if we have a community that has been identified as being one of those high-risk communities who were negatively impacted by COVID, then where they live, they would then qualify for that particular programming, correct?
Correct. And just by way of example, so I can be very specific and very clear, if you look at and listen to the health information for our community, one of the things that you will see is specifically that you happen to mention it, but the 29203 area, when they talk about the life expectancy from one zip code to a next, and how that COVID came in and exacerbated that, you can take a look at that data, and Prisma actually has that because they utilize that data as a part of their program, and they'll just show you how the disparate impact between the zip codes and how one was, or not just one, but that was one that really stood out. I mean, big time as it relates to the data that they collected. And so, yes, ma'am, there can be communities that are impacted. And again, when I talked about defining that impact group, that's what I meant. So we're talking about a zip code, or you're talking about a subsection within a zip code, or you're talking about some other, identifier that is tied to one of those socio determinants that, again, are more standard and more general. But yes, you can do that as we just talked about.
Thank you, because I heard a lot of conversation centered around individuals, and I don't want us to forget about that. We do have this broad way of identifying those groups in the community. Ms. Newton, back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this will be hopefully my last comment for a while, and I'll just listen. I'm very, curious to hear and open to hearing what the body has to say. I'll just say, for me, when you look at our youth, I mean, it's complicated, right? This is a youth and recreation category, but we know that, as someone was mentioning, our children are affected by their environment. There's their physical health, there's their mental health, there's education, there's, family structure. All of these things play together as it relates to our youth, and they're all important and they're all valid. I'll say, for me, while I'm not opposed to tutoring or education assistance, even though we did already have an education assistance category, where my heart more naturally leads me, for lack of a better way to say it, are things that are going to engage our youth that they might be excited to do. Again, maybe not knocking tutoring or anything like that. I guess I just see such a need, again, for our kids to be engaged and stimulated and have activities that just, provide different opportunities for them. So open to all the things, happy to hear what the body has to say. But for me, I'm more inclined towards more on the recreation, more on the activity, more on the enrichment spectrum, than something that might feel like school. But I'm totally open. Thank you, Ms. Barron.
Thank you. And I just want us to remember that we have these categories in place. So this discussion is not necessarily to determine, how we identify the category, because we specifically left it broad for that reason. And so what I'd like for us to really walk away today after this conversation is to say, what are our next steps to getting these funds back into motion? So we already have identified that we're looking at youth and recreation as the category. As Ms. McBride stated, that's wide open. It could encompass lots of things. Mr. Brown clearly identified some areas that it could be connected to. But what I'd like to hear us discuss is, how do we get this pot of money back in motion so that we could have those organizations that are out there get the money? If that means that we go back to, an application process, or if we want to do some type of, agreement with a particular organization, I don't know what that is, but that's where I'd like to see this conversation land, is so that how can we move this pot? You recognize Ms. McBride.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. One thing I would like to see, and I'm glad you brought this up, is to actually look at the data and help and define our needs. I think we've missed that in a lot of cases. So we look at the data, which we will be in compliance with ARPA in finding what's needed out there and including the communities in terms of what those communities need, and not for us to sit up here and try to tell them what they need, and not for us to have another open process for discretionary grants coming, wherein the people that are actually working in the communities are not getting the funding through the application process. I would like to see a totally integrated process where we have community input, we have data, we analyze the data, and then we determine how these funds will be used. I know that we've done a discretionary process, and I've talked about the pros and cons of that process. And oftentimes, those communities that need the most do not get it. And those agencies that work in the communities do not receive the funding. So if we could, Ms. Barron, if we could look at a process to make sure that we have an inclusive and equitable process that will involve the total community, I think that would be a good step forward.
So, and I just wanted to make sure that I'm fully tracking with you. And that is what I heard you say was that we need community input. And so very similarly to when we started this process, how we came to the categories, we put out a survey. So are you suggesting that perhaps we put out a survey and ask and assess the community specific to this particular category around youth and recreation services?
Okay. So to me, the survey is not enough.
Okay.
Because oftentimes, when we do a survey, the people that we need the response from, we do not get it from the surveys. Because the people that need it most and can give us the input, basically many of them don't respond to surveys. I'm not saying that the survey is not good, but that's only one means of it. You know, what we've done in every project that we thought was serious enough, we actually got community input from the community. Whether we went, it's a lot of coalitions that are already out there. It's a lot of people that specialize in youth and recreation work. The youth are out there. If we could get that type of input, we look at the data that we already have through the CD, for Community Development Block Grant Programs, they have some data. If we could look at all that data and put it together, not just rely on one source.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me further to understand, because I'm just kind of taking some notes, because we do. I think that the entire body feels the same way. You know, we want to stay good to what we said, but I can't help that. To have my filter, and that's my community, and there's a crisis in my community, and what they're saying is they need youth and recreation. And it's not that I expect that all the funds will go to District 7. That's not my intent, and I want to be real clear. But it does identify that there is a need that needs to be addressed, and the fact that we have $1 million that can assist with that, whether it's in District 7 or District 11 or 1 or 5, it doesn't matter. I can assure you that the problem is out there, and so that's why I have this push right now. Let's clearly define how we're going to determine where these funds go and where they land, whether it's a survey and a focus group and community input, and then coming back and saying, okay, this is what the community said, and then continue with the process. I'm fine with that. But just note, as we do the work and keep it moving, life is still happening. There's still lack of services. And is it a 911? And this is, I think, yeah, there's a 911, but I know that this process doesn't move by the 911 system. I understand that. But this it's gonna come out probably a little harsh, but I'll say it anyway, and that is, we saw how fast government can move when we started moving with Scout. We did, and that's economic development. And we're talking about children. We're talking about youth. So I'm all for a process, and I'm all for gathering data, and we got it. And because what we're hearing resounding in the community is, stop giving us these programs that we don't need. So I get that part. So let's figure out how we determine what it is they need. But it's this body's job to make sure that that we're funding it. And so that's my question. How do we get the funds to them? After we determine what the needs are, how do we get it to them? So, Ms. Newton, you recognize. There, Ms. Newton?
Yeah, sorry, it takes me a second to unmute. I guess I feel like my question wasn't an answer to the question that you just raised, which is a valid one. So I'll just acknowledge that. What I was going to say is that, well, first, I mean, there's so much that our youth needs. There's so much that our community needs. And so I guess for me, one next step, I certainly believe in looking at data. And I also think that there's data that we already have. And so one of the things that I would wonder is there more specific information that we can give staff? And then are there other data that they can share with us, not now during this meeting, but, can we give some direction so that they can come back to us? And then that would be preliminary information where we can either say, oh my gosh, all of our issues are in this one street. So maybe we don't talk to everybody in the community. Maybe we talk to this one street, and that's hypothetical. That's not what would happen. But, that if we had some of this information that we're talking about, that could point us in a better direction in terms of where we want to go. So for example, as it relates to a survey, I don't have a problem doing a survey, while I certainly acknowledge that, Ms. McBride has already named some of the challenges with that. But even if you're going to do something like a survey, having an advanced starting point where we're looking at this data, where we're able to ask more specific questions, where we're able to go to more specific people, I think would be helpful. So all that to say, one of the next steps that I think we should see is having a look at some of that data, which can help us be more targeted and in truth compliant with what we're trying to do.
So, Ms. Newton, I am open for a motion at this point that if it is your desire to move forward with some type of directive for Mr. Brown and his team, I'm definitely open at this point.
And I'm happy to make a motion. I would just have two questions before I made it. One is, there may be other direction. You may have direction. So before I make a motion, is there somebody else that wants to add to that so that we could have one? And then secondly, if there's any specific data that we want to mention by name, let me know and I'll include that. Otherwise, I'll ask that, we maybe direct our clerk also to reach out to every council member and find out the specific things that they would want to see so we can include that information. So if we're ready for a motion, I'm ready. But if someone else needs to speak to it, I want to listen.
So I think that there are many categories that we could really horn in on. I do like the idea of starting with the clerk and asking her to, reach out to council members to look at specific categories. But I think that this is also one of those areas that we could start to see what data is available for us on a county level that we can, start to horn in on, even though we may not have our category specific. But if we can go ahead and instruct this or to request the staff to start to research what data does the county have relative to youth and recreation services. And then once we receive information back from council members, we can take that data and see if there are any any corresponding categories that are related to either one. So if we have academics on the list for council, then we could take that list that we get from the staff and say, hey, is academics as a part of, do we have that covered in our data? So I think that both are great options, and to keep the ball moving, I think we could possibly do both. But again, we're open for discussion. So anyone here in the chambers that would like to add on to this discussion, please feel free before we move forward with the motion. Ms. McBride, you're recognized.
I agree with the almost motion that's about to be made. But I would like to, for us, maybe the sheriff's department could give us some data on youth crime as a part of that. As because when we looked at the child, the whole child, I would like to have that crime data.
Further?
No, I really appreciate the conversation, and through this whole time have just been thinking about the impact of, to me, a lot of this comes back to like isolation that has really affected folks. And I think getting people together again in a meaningful way will be very helpful.
So back to you, Ms. Newton, because as of right now, it's just the two of us that are present as it relates to committee members.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I can't see your face on my Zoom screen, so I can't get any feedback. So I'll
Wave
try.
my hands.
First,
You see me?
I do see your hands. If it's really wrong, I guess you can wave them again. So first, my understanding is that we don't need a motion to direct our clerk to do things. So I would ask that the clerk reach out to all council members and explain to them that staff is going to be gathering data about community needs for youth and recreation services, and ask if they have input that they want to share, either in general or places where they would like to see more data. I do think, Ms. Barron, that we should provide a target date to get that input. So we don't necessarily have to decide that right now, but I do think it's helpful.
I think we do. I think we do if we're directing the clerk at this point, because it would be my expectation that this would be something that we would move on within the days to come. So I would say if we give them, a full 2 weeks, the 31st.
Works for me.
The
Okay.
31st. That'll be their trick and their treat.
or let's do November 1st. Let's let people have their Halloween.
Okay, I'm good.
Just treats.
Just treats.
So, Madam Clerk, is that clear enough for you to be able to solicit feedback from council?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, then. All right, Ms. Barron, I'm going to try to look for your hands.
Okay.
I move that we direct the administrator to gather COVID-related data, impact data that pertains to youth and recreation services for committee and council consideration to award ARPA grants. And that research should include any areas submitted by council members where there is data, input from the sheriff's department where applicable, and examples of other community programs in these areas using ARPA or other funding.
Second. That was good. That was good. So we're open for discussion, And so some of the, I just want to talk through, when we start to look at data relative to COVID numbers, we know DHEC is going to be our friend. We know we already have some internal departments that we can tap into. Ms. McBride has already talked about the community block grant. She's talked about the sheriff's department. So we know those are baselines for us. And I want to be clear so that those are our expectations as a baseline, and any other categories we will get from council members. So as we get those, Mr. Brown, then we will be, I guess those will be where you'll start to filter the information that you've already gathered. And then if you need to go back out and get some more, this is my thought process.
Acknowledged.
Okay, great. Any further discussion? Ms. Newton, I see you.
Thank you. So I couldn't repeat that motion again if I had to, but I think I used the language COVID impacts just to say to staff that in addition to the things that you mentioned just now, Ms. Barron, there might be other broad impacts. For example, we talked about educational impacts and others. So that the staff should really feel free, again, for things that are relevant to this discussion. If there's something that we haven't specifically mentioned, but they see a data point or informational point, that they shouldn't feel limited.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. Mr. Brown is nodding, acknowledging.
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? If not, Ms. Carrillo?
Brenham, Barron,
Yes?
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Great. So we'll reconvene and start to have, or to continue to have this discussion. Our next item for discussion is affordable housing. So as I mentioned earlier, we had already allocated this $4 million, or we have reallocated this $4 million. It now lies in our general fund budget. And although this committee, it has been passed on through full council, I felt the need for it to come and for us to have this conversation coming from this committee. And it's my hopes that we could give some type of framework to full council as a recommendation, and then from there, ask that would be placed in a committee. And I'm thinking, in my, just out loud and just having spoken to the chair as well as Mr. Brown, that would land probably in DNS. We've had high-level conversations about affordable housing, but we have not gotten down into the trenches of what it really looks like. Many of us have studied it. Many of us have had the meetings about it. There are many organizations out encouraging us to address it. But I think what's most important is that this council feels comfortable with the framework and what we are putting forth. And so it would be my desire before I say that, Mr. Livingston in one of our previous meetings brought up a great point when we started talking about affordable housing and what affordable housing could be defined as. And when we say $4 million, it's very nearly impossible and we found this out during our grant application process, for us to be able to give this funds or to award these funds to an organization to acquire land, to build, get permitting, and all those things from ground zero within the period of time that initially we had set forth for as a part of the ARPA guidelines. Even with that, we hear in our community on a regular basis that there's a housing crisis. And I think that for this body, we need to address the needs of our community. And as we address the needs of the community, one of which has been affordable housing. So back to Mr. Livingston's point, he said, could we not define affordable housing in looking at new housing units, taking a home that was not on the market, and then allowing those funds to remodel, refurbish, and then now placing that home back on the market in a particular price point. Now, based on, I think we had lots of lengthy conversation. We got guidance from our attorney as well. And so for me, I would like to say we would identify affordable housing as such, saying that we have, there's a vacant property that we want to take these funds to assist to get them back on the market, then now rentable, and then those individuals who qualify would be able to rent those homes. That's my thought on it, but I want us to have a little conversation about it, because I do think that it would be good for us to not have a blank slate saying we're going to address affordable housing, but we have not identified what affordable housing looks like for this body. And I don't know if that we need to do it as a work session, if we need to outside consultants, all those things, those recommendations, but just noting that with this pot of money, anything that we do externally could be additional cost. I'm not suggesting that at all, but in some of the conversations that I've had, it appears that may be the way, but I think that there are other modes that we can look at. We could look at existing organizations who are in the affordable housing industry. Could we not do a partnership with them to get those funds back out there? So I'm going to be quiet for a minute, but I just wanted to kind of lay the foundation as to why I put this on the agenda, and hopefully we can land with some healthy conversation. Ms. Newton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Barron. So over the summer at SCAC, Councilwoman Terracio, Councilman Livingston, and I had an opportunity to meet with Bright House to talk through some things on affordable housing. And I thought that conversation was fruitful. And I think, not to volunteer your staff, Mr. Brown, and I for sure can't see your face, I can barely see the back of your head, I think Ms. Thomas has some additional information that she might be able to share on that front. But I guess what I would say is this. For me, I don't feel that an affordable housing framework, the way that I envision it, is something that I see coming out of this committee today or in the near future. And the reason that I say that is because, to your point about all of the questions that we have about affordable housing, I think that we as the whole body need to have a conversation and think through those things together, because even if we make a recommendation, we still ultimately end up at that point where we as a full body have to talk about, of all the different facets of affordable housing, where do we want to focus and where do we need to go? But I think that it really comes from understanding our needs and to look at data in this area. And so for me, I guess I would like to start with feeling like I have a really clear picture of what the market looks like in Richland County. Is there a particular type of housing that we need the most? Is there a particular area that needs it most? Is there a particular workforce group that needs it most? But what is the real situation on the ground? We know that there's no community in the entire country that has a sufficient stock of affordable housing. So we know that this is where we are. But I would just like to start with looking at data that can help us guide our conversation about how we want to focus and where we need to go. And so that is kind of what I would like to see. And if it would be okay, if Ms. Thomas or Mr. Brown's other designee could address what we know about where we are, that would be helpful for me to make a recommendation about where we go.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Brown, right before you address Ms. Newton, I will say that I think that a framework that could possibly come out of this committee could be exactly what you said, and that is for us to have a work session or to have some discussion on identifying what affordable housing is and is not, driven by data. So that could very well be the framework that this body, brings forth. But if we don't bring something forth, this $4 million just sits and there is no conversation. And so I'm okay with that. And I'm fine with, that being a recommendation coming out of this committee. But I'll stop there. I just wanted to just put that there so that I'm on board with that. Mr. Brown?
Well, could I just acknowledge it? I'll just say Thank you, Ms. Barron, for that clarification. When I heard the word framework and then some of your questions, I thought you were saying, let us right now define what is affordable housing and all those things. So thank you. It's more of a framework of next steps and how we're going to proceed. So I appreciate the clarification and thank you.
Absolutely. Mr. Brown?
Yes, ma'am, Madam Chair. If you would recognize ACA Thomas, that'll be appreciated. Thank you.
Ms. Thomas, you recognize.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. So as I understand, during the conversations that were had at the SCAC meeting, one of the topics that was discussed with the group was that the group seemed to feel that there was a need to understand, what our existing place is in the market, what our future place should be in the market, and the demand, and how that helps to develop a housing strategy for long-range housing planning. And one component of that would be, of course, workforce and or affordable housing. The consultant had referenced that they do have an arm that does these kind of studies. The studies can be as broad or as narrow as you would like for them to be. There are about 6 different categories that they have listed to look at, including assessing the existing studies and data, engaging local stakeholders, doing trend forecasting, identify national best practices, develop policy and program solutions to address the housing needs, and then a housing strategy and policy. Any or all of those components could be a part of that. And I do apologize. I wish I could have gotten you all copies of this, but I got it about an hour before this meeting. Giving an idea of the timing and how long it would take to do something like that, depending on how broad and how involved and how much community input that you do want in this, you're looking at a 6 to 12 month time frame, and estimating the investment to do something like that, you're probably talking somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000, depending on whether you want to do all of it or a portion of it. And I'm open to any questions that you all may have.
So when you say consultant, are we speaking of Guidehouse?
Yes, ma'am, we are.
Okay.
And of course, we could look at other sources also, but this just gave us a good idea of what we would be looking at.
Okay. And so I will say that I think having Guidehouse, as a resource is helpful. However, as I stated a couple of years ago, sometimes the overuse of a particular vendor could lend for different results. And I will just say that we, and everyone in this room will know exactly what I'm talking about. We have used a particular vendor for a very long time, and now we're not as happy about what we're getting. And that's a lighthearted analogy, and it's definitely not pointed at Guidehouse, but I do think that just opening up some other opportunities to take a look at this. Although Guidehouse provides us a wheelhouse of all things, they have it all covered. But I would like to have, I guess, a more robust conversation with someone who this is what they do. This is what they do. Miss McBride, you're recognized.
Thank you. I agree with you, Chairman Barron. I just think that, first of all, I am so happy to be a part of this conversation for the last hour. To actually let us start looking at data and defining how we're going to fund things and the process. So I want to thank you for that. So, you know, I've been on my soap opera, Mr. Brown. And so this is what I've been preaching about. This is what I've been preaching about so that we can be accountable for the fundings and how we use these grants. So I thank you all for that. Regarding the affordable housing funding plan, Councilman Terratio has been very involved in this area. This is a really complex area to me because you have to really understand what affordable housing is and all the different aspects of affordable housing. And I think you mentioned a work session or something, but I think the full council needs to understand what affordable housing is. We've done a lot of studies in Columbia. Mr. Ratio, you've done some, your committee work, right? I think that we need to use the existing studies that we have and not put the $300,000 for a consultant. I'd rather put that in a house for somebody, or 2 people, 3 people. So I'm leery of going back to a consultant at that cost and the same consultant. I'm leery of that. And even though we've had a tough grant process and we've had to do so many things over, we finally got to where most people are satisfied with the formal grant process that we have in place. But it took us a time. It took a while to get there. And so I would like to look at the data that we have, use the expertise that we have, and come up with something that the council itself can understand what affordable housing is and our options, best practices, where that we can make the best or most informed decision.
Thank you, Ms. McBride. Ms. Terratio, you recognized.
Thank you. Just wanted to respond that over the past couple of years, I guess it's been, that the City of Columbia has had their Affordable Housing Task Force in place. They've been presented with a lot of data and information about where the opportunities are and where the needs are in the City of Columbia. I would think that the folks who have done that work have probably have a finger on the full picture of Richland County. So I don't think it would take much for us to take some of that data and extrapolate on it so that we can learn where our dollars can be best placed.
Thank you, Ms. Terratio. Ms. Newton, I see are you unmuted? Do I see that, or?
I am now.
Okay. Would you like to be recognized?
Sure. Thank you. So I think this has been a good conversation. And I personally, while I am fine with the idea of bringing in a consultant to do that deep level analysis, I think that Ms. McBride and Ms. Terratio make some valid points. And I think that we can certainly glean a lot from data and information that we already have available, which then can tell us, what do we need to do next? Where do we need more data? Where do we need more stakeholder input, or whatever the case may be? I also think that, that might be a conversation our staff wants to facilitate, or it may be something shy of a $300,000 engagement might be where it still might make sense to have some outside facilitator of the conversation and looking at our data that we have, just depending on where we want to go. So I guess what I feel like, hearing the things that I've heard, that a next step would be to have a work session, or I don't know how far we are in terms of the agenda for our strategic planning session. Maybe it's a conversation there, but something like that, where there's a conversation of the full body, where we have relevant data presented to us, I think would be helpful. I just don't know. I guess I would want to hear from staff. Does staff feel like they can gather all of that relevant data? Do they feel like there's some other subject matter expertise that they would want to bring in just to make sure that the conversation we have is fruitful?
Mr. Brown?
Thank you for the question and the recognition, Madam Chair. I think one of the things that Councilmember Terratio pointed out was that this happened over an extended period of time. And I think one of the things that we might want to consider, and I mentioned this actually early on in this process, you know, how much time do we want to invest in determining what that means for Richland County? So, for example, there was a statement, hey, administrator, develop a plan, bring it back to the committee. But one of the things I raised as a question was there was different questions about what was affordable housing for the county. So whether that was, and I'm not saying this to anybody who's asked to meet with me, was that in a form of a trust fund? Was that rehabilitating a unit that was out of commission and bringing it on commission? Was that the construction of a new unit that never existed? And as you all have just highlighted, all of those things can be components, but you may not be able to focus on all of them, and maybe all of that's not where the county wants to focus. So I think what I'm hearing is what I believe is necessary certainly is a work session, but it may not be one work session. We may actually need to have, this is me, if I can use a Miss Barron moment, talking out loud. Maybe, for example, we have local organizations that work in the area of affordable and or workforce housing. Maybe they come to us in different work sessions and talk about the data that they've utilized in our community that drives how they're working, and maybe we are determining whether or not how we might want to support that, whatever unit of particular affordable and or workforce housing we decide. But maybe you hear from those entities who do that. They gather the data, they work in that environment, they report out to agencies, they receive dollars from federal, state, and local jurisdictions. So they're going to have mechanisms to be able to provide you with the type of impact that they've been able to have on the local community that they serve. But that's probably not one work session, and that's probably not one entity, and that's not one voice. So yes, I think we can gather that data, but I think you're going to be best served as we do have those professionals come in, not necessarily consultants. We may decide to take a consultant later on, but have those individuals come in and share that, and then that helps us determine what we see as Richland County's investment in affordable and or workforce housing, or both. So that's a lot of talking, but I'm just trying to identify that I think work sessions would be plural and not one.
Ms. Newton, we'll go to you, and then we'll come to you, Ms. McBride.
I'm happy to yield to Ms. McBride.
You're going to have to switch places.
The CDBG grant, it has affordable housing, I think. Is that not correct?
They have some components. They provide funding for housing, and that, yes, ma'am, they have some components of
Okay.
that.
So, I want to bring them, I know it's separate in terms of funding, but I want to look at the issue, because they had to write a grant and they had to define the problem for affordable housing, the issues and why we need it. But I would like for us to look at those resources holistically, with the understanding that, we've got the resources here and we've got resources there, how that we can make sure that we're focusing and staying within the federal guidelines. So I would like to know the funding availability from CDBG grants and the expiration and the requirements, so that we can look at all those funds together in addressing affordable housing, and some of the research that they have done. Because in order to write that grant, which I always give whoever wrote the grant, I don't know where she is, but he did an outstanding job, and the input, because they got input from a number of the entities that work with affordable housing. So I would like some of that input too from them.
Yes, ma'am. My understanding would be that would be an example of additional local resources
Right.
that work in that area, including what Richland County does with funding that we received related to low to moderate income individuals.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind you to use that data.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
And so before I go to you, Ms. Newton, I just want to insert and say that, you know, if the county has to some degree identified how we address affordable housing, even if it's through the community block grant, maybe that's where we start. Because that could be a baseline for us, because there's some work that's already been done there. And, you know, we might not have to work as hard to define what affordable housing is, because they could have already done this for us. Maybe not as detailed, but it could lend to, you know, that baseline. Anything, Ms. Brown, before I turn to Ms. Newton? Oh, Mr. Wright, you're recognized. I thought
Yes,
y'all
sir.
were switching seats so Mr. Brown could have a permanent microphone.
No, my microphone's not working right now.
Okay, got it. Okay, got it.
And I just wanted to say that, you know, some of the work has already, as Ms. Terratio has stated, which initially how I kind of got to know Ms. Terratio was being a part of the Affordable Housing Task Force, which was spearheaded by former City Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine. And they took a lot of time in getting definitions for affordable housing and workforce housing. And there were a number of stakeholders in both the city of Columbia and Richland County that are a part of this task force and the meetings we used to have. And so I think a lot of the information that we would get through a lot of these work sessions or consultants, wherever, already exists, because we've already worked to do that work probably 2 years ago or more, before I even came to Richland County. So I think that, you know, we can kind of get in contact with them and get some of that information that already exists, to save months of time instead of redoing things that have already been done. And we can just, you know, get that information and use it and give county council an opportunity to look at this information and look at the options and the definitions and say, hey, this is something that we would be interested in doing, or something that we wouldn't be interested in doing. So instead of taking that time to just kind of regather information that's already been gathering, we can just get that information and council can consider it and say, hey, this is what we want to do.
Well, I thank you for lending that, because I think that goes to my point. You know, anything that we have that's already out there, I think that's where we start the conversation. But for me, what's always helpful when we have our work sessions, one of the work sessions that I enjoy the most, but not really, and that is when during budget time, y'all dig deep and you present the information to us, and you go line by line and there's explanations. So I would like to also say that when we move forward with having these conversations, that this information is presented to us. It's one thing to give it to us in a packet, but it's another when it's presented, and then it allows us to have conversation along the way. So that's just a preference, and it's something that the staff does really well. So I think if it ain't broke, let's don't fix it. Ms. Newton, we've inserted all over your time, but please.
Thank you. I'm reclaiming my time. No, just kidding. So a lot has been said. So to say where I'm in agreement, certainly I don't want us to reinvent the wheel. I do want to acknowledge, and I wasn't part of the committee with the city, but the city of Columbia is not Richland County. It's a small part of Richland County. And as a person who represents large swaths of Richland County that are not in the city, I want to make sure that we have all of the information that we need, and that we're not, you know, while that data is valuable, that we make sure that we're not putting square pegs in round holes in some places. And so just to acknowledge that. And I think for me, Mr. Brown, in all of the things that he said, asked a question that I really would like to address right now, which was to say, how long do we want to spend on this process? And so I just want to go on record and say, for me, I think it is a process that, while I don't want to reinvent the wheel, I think is worthy of investing a significant amount of time, because what I would love to see as an outcome of this is not just how are we going to spend this $4 million, which, let's face it, is not a tremendous amount of money to throw at housing, but how are we going to spend this $4 million, and what is Richland County's policy, what is Richland County's priority as it relates to affordable housing? Because there are things that we need to look at as it relates to economic development. There are things that we need to look at as it relates to our land development code. There are things that we can look at in terms of, I mentioned economic development, in terms of incentives that we offer, in terms of business licensing, in terms of partnerships, in terms of the breadth and depth of what a county like Richland County could do if we really dedicate ourselves to affordable housing is a lot. And so just want to say that for me, I think I'm willing to invest, as much time as it takes. Though I like this advanced starting point of looking at the data that we have, of not starting with some big report. So again, want to make sure that we have all the data that we need across the entire county. And I'll also just say, if it's multiple work sessions, I agree. I think I'm fine with that. I just want to make sure that we give our staff the latitude and resources that they need, so that when other people need to facilitate the conversation, they do, in terms of who might be the person that really understands this set of data or that set of data. And just to say again, not that I think we need to start with a consultant, but I do think that there's a potential, even in this initial phase, not for a $300,000 engagement, but is there somebody that can look at the data that we already have? That would be a lot to present in one session or 5 work sessions, and kind of maybe summarize and synthesize what we already have so that it's presented in the most helpful way. And that's it.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And so at this point, what we, I think that we have to make a decision, how do we direct the staff to move forward with addressing this? I'm not opposed to taking a stab at it, but it's probably going to come out real slow and probably botched, but we'll get through it. So I'd like to say that we'll direct the staff to research all available data that's local, both through the city as well as internally, to begin the initial process to discussing affordable housing through work sessions as decided upon by full council. I don't know. Does that work? Ms. Newton? Is it clear? Does it need something?
It might, but I'll second it.
Discussion.
Ms. Barron?
Yes.
The one thing that I would just want to make sure that we're including in there, because, we talked about data around affordable housing, is to make sure that that data includes, any identified needs. Because we can have data about this is what affordable housing is, and, this is how many units we have of this, and this is how many units we have of that. But if we know, for example, that first level sheriff's deputy can't buy a house, and I say that hypothetically, or a teacher who's fresh out of college or whatever. I mean, if there's any identified needs should be part of that data and not just availability of housing.
Agreed. Mr. Brown, are you clear? Or do we need, would you like?
No, I'm clear on what the ask is. I think as we go through the information, that'll be kind of when you start digging. So yes, ma'am, I'm clear on the ask.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because I think that to me, I appreciate Ms. Newton pulling that information out, but I think that would be part of what you're going to provide as you get the information from the city and, you know, any other readily available information. I do agree that it's important because I also have had conversations with the city, you know, in addressing other items, and they said, well, we have this here in the city, and that works well for the city, but when we have unincorporated areas of Richland County, we have to make sure that that data is reflective so that we can service the entire county as well. Mr. Wright, you're recognized.
Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to say that the Affordable Housing Task Force wasn't just the city. It was spearheaded by Ms. Isaac, who was a council person for the city, but it was Richland County, I think Lexington County, the Housing Authority, some both state entities, local entities, and the whole point was to do things that affect the entire Midlands. So they have stats and other information that it's not just City of Columbia. It was for the Midlands in general, really, in the state of South Carolina.
Thank you for clearing that up because that's going to be extremely helpful for us. And I think that it does lend for I guess my word of the day might be baseline, you know, a healthy baseline for us to start, because it doesn't mean we don't need to reinvent the wheel if the information's out there. But I can't say it enough. We have to start the conversation, because it's not enough for us just to allocate the funds. Now that we have the money in the bank, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? And I agree with Ms. Newton wholeheartedly. I don't want us to rush the process, but I also don't want us to be silent and stay on pause as well. Let's show some movement and some priorities. And perhaps maybe this is something that we do also address in the strategic plan. You know, is that a priority of this council? And if it is, then, you know, perhaps that's also an additional conversation that we need to have. Any further discussion?
Ms.
Recognize.
Barron, thank you. I guess so we have this motion on the floor to have the work sessions, and I think that that's great. I guess my question would be, is the idea that this is something that would come back to this committee, or, you know, what would be the mechanism if we're shifting it to DNS to shift it to DNS, or if we're shifting it to some other committee to shift it to that committee?
So I think that, you know, my initial conversation, you know, with Mr. Brown and the Chairman Walker, was that, you know, some type of framework would come out of this committee and it could go to DNS. But I do think that based upon this motion, this could come to full council as a recommendation that full council could then act on and make a determination at that point. And I personally don't see where it needs to go to a committee, but we can start to act on it as a full council. Mr. Wright?
I think that's a possibility. If the motion is something that's referred to full council, then full council can take it up. And a work session can be done in front of full council as well.
Thank you. Ms. Newton, you still have the floor.
I'm ready to vote.
All right, well, let's do it. Ms. Carrillo?
Brenham, Barron,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
All right, thank you all so much. And our next order of business is adjournment.
So moved.
Second, Ms. Carrillo?
Barron,
Yes?
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
We're adjourned, and thank you everyone for participating in a healthy dialogue today.